Thank you everyone for joining the webinar this afternoon. I hope you're having a wonderful day. My name is Lindsay Pekosh. I am the Associate Director of Graduate Admissions and Global Online at California University of Pennsylvania. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second in our spring webinar series lineup. Today's webinar, School Violence, Origins, Identification, Assessment, and Prevention, will examine violence as it impacts the social and structural institutions of school. Content will include analysis of bullying, fighting, harassment, risk factors, and institutional perceptions, as well as proposed remedies. It is my honor to introduce to you a leader in the psychology, social deviance, and educational industries, Dr. Emily Sweitzer. Dr. Sweitzer is professor of sociology, social deviance concentration. She is also the director of liberal studies and the coordinator of the social deviance program in sociology. She is a nationally certified school psychologist and is certified as a K-12 principal. Dr. Sweitzer has been employed as a family therapist, school psychologist, and assistant principal prior to coming to CalU. She has completed a post-baccalaureate certificate in forensic science and law and is a graduate of Violent Behavior 1, a specialized and invited training offered by former and retired members of the Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI. She has published several book chapters and is author of Developing Social Interest Within Conduct Disordered Adolescents, an Adlerian Approach, and has published articles and newsletters pertaining to child behavioral development, ethical development, and decision-making. In 2007, Dr. Sweitzer was awarded the Presidential Faculty Award for Teaching. Dr. Sweitzer has appeared on WPXI TV's Target 11 Investigates, School Safety Reports, and is a psychological and sociocultural consultant to the television programs Bones, CSI, Blacklist, Rosewood, Lucifer and Backstrom, as well as a master trainer for Cops and Kids, a Fred Rogers Foundation program. Following Dr. Sweitzer's presentation this afternoon, we'll have time for a quick Q&A segment. So if throughout the presentation you think of a question for Dr. Sweitzer, please send it through the chat function directly to me, and I'll be compiling a list of questions for Dr. Sweitzer at the end of the moderation. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn everything over to Dr. Sweitzer for the webinar. Dr. Sweitzer?
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Foremost, I'd like to thank you for recognizing the importance of this issue and your willingness to learn and serve as a change agent to make our schools and children safe. Violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. Someone just doesn't wake up and decide to act. It evolves from one's personal life experiences, how those perceptions are interpreted, and the meanings that are attached to those perceptions. It finally culminates in decisions for behavioral acts. Basically, you have a choice, and your choice is based on whether or not you believe that a choice exists or whether or not you have something to lose. This is a very paramount meaning for us to consider when we're beginning to look at the reasons behind many acts of violence, seemingly nonsensical acts of violence occur. One of the first things that I want to introduce you to is what's called the interpersonal aggression cycle. Aggression, as I said, just doesn't happen. It is first interpreted, it is perceived, and it holds particular meaning for the offender. It always begins with the cognitive aspect. This is your interpretation of what you believe is transpiring. It may be real, it may be based in reality, or it may be something that is just significant to you or perceived. So it begins with the cognitive aspect, which is thoughts, feelings, and interpretations. It then proceeds to behavioral reactions as a result of those thoughts, feelings, and interpretations. So basically, you act in accordance with what you think. And then, once your behavior transpires, it takes on a psychosocial approach. And what that means is the reactions of others are then perceived, and additional meaning is attached to those reactions for future behaviors. When you think about this, I oftentimes give an example of a school student on a bus. If you can picture in your mind a student arriving to school, looking out the bus window, and they see another group of students looking at them, peering at them from outside on the sidewalk. The student then interprets the other students watching them as either a positive, neutral, or negative act. So their interpretation is based on their past interpersonal relationships with students and those past feelings that they have associated with them. Let's say, for instance, the student perceives the other students looking at them as judgmental, as negative. They then have a choice. When I get off of the bus, how am I going to react based on what I'm perceiving? Am I going to run, duck, or hide if I believe those reactions as negative and perhaps I'm somewhat insecure? Or are they themselves perhaps an aggressor and they perceive those acts as something is challenging? Their behaviors are going to respond in one of two different ways. As I said, they're either going to try to avoid those students, or they themselves are going to enter in some type of confrontation with those students. Their behaviors then prompt the behaviors with the student standing on the sidewalk. Do they ignore the student? Do they laugh at the student? Do they say something to the student, either challenging or call them odd or provide any types of gestures or other body language? So it becomes a vicious cycle in which those initial thoughts based on prior experiences then control all future experiences. When you look at what is a threat, and if you examine these questions for a few seconds, what do you perceive as a threat? An angry student saying, "I'm going to kill you"? Two students get in an argument and one punches the other? A student with a history of fighting draws up a list of students to beat up? How would you answer these questions? Are they a threat? The obvious answer is yes. Every single one of these questions or scenarios posed are threats. But the question becomes, at what level is this a threat? What is the intensity behind these meanings? Today, I'm hoping to be able to provide you with a brief overview of how to identify threats and consider the intensity of the threat. Ultimately, it is the concentration that determines various characteristics, the viability, and most importantly, the intensity of the delivery of the threat now, or if not now, is it potentially able to occur within the future? So it's no longer okay to just say, is this a threat? We have to consider the means behind the threat and its capabilities for developing. Essentially, violence occurs in a cycle. And as if you refer back to where the example I gave with the student on the bus, it always begins with that cognitive evaluation. It then moves based on that cognitive evaluation to a behavioral act. That act then is interpreted based on the reactions of others. And again, your reactions transpire. So it's this cycle, never-ending cycle, that continues, that is initially based upon how we think of situations, people, and circumstances. Our cognitions, our meanings are always attached to our behaviors and are reinforced, again, by our perceptions of how others react to us. As we move on, it's important to understand the different types of aggression. Aggression is intentional behavior aimed at causing either physical or psychological pain. It is never an accident. If it was accidental, it would be called an accident, but it's intentional. So that's why we term it as aggression. There's different forms of aggression, which are important in understanding the meanings and perhaps the preventative measures for various types of aggression. The first is hostile. Hostile aggression comes from feelings of anger. and the sole purpose is to inflict pain or injury. Overwhelmingly, males initiate more hostile behavior. Oftentimes, it's a rash reaction. Instrumental aggression, which is completely opposite, is an intention to hurt another as a means to a goal other than causing pain. This can be much more dangerous because obviously some type of planning is involved. It isn't a rash reaction. It is a thoughtful, reflective reaction assumed to cause someone some type of extenuating difficulties or problems. I often give the example of hockey as a means to understand the difference between hostile and instrumental aggression. We all like to go to hockey games to see the fights. The fights would be termed hostile aggression. Instrumental aggression would be a hockey player checking another hockey player so as to prevent them from scoring a goal. There's a means to the aggression. Relational aggression damages peer relationships. Oftentimes, this is much more of a female characteristic, and in layman's terms, we can call it gossip. It destroys any type of interpersonal relationships or attempts to destroy. Overt aggression is what we see, the physical hitting, the sarcasm, the mouthing off, and again, much more typical of males than females, but again, females can exhibit and often do exhibit overt aggression. Covert aggression is subtle, hidden, and not easily identified. These are your covert acts of vandalism. Again, your relational aggression. Oftentimes it has a more sociocultural twist to it, as we'll see in the next minute, with gender differences. As I mentioned, males are more aggressive under normal circumstances, and that's just typical because of varying hormonal levels and different levels of testosterone. However, females, when provoked, when agitated, can exhibit the same amount of aggression as do males. They just need a stimulus that is provoking to them, or an agitator. Again, males show more overt aggression, and this is where the tie to a sociocultural link comes in play. Females have historically been socialized to not show or display aggression. As a result, females developed a more covert means of displaying aggression. They may either choose to do things such as I mentioned as vandalism, underhanded, get someone to act for them, or manipulate someone to act for them, rather than them acting overtly as would a male. That doesn't mean that females don't exhibit overt aggression. It's just typically not their most prominent style in displaying aggression. As we move on, what also becomes important, what sometimes people forget to think about, is situational causes of aggression. This is very important even when you're considering building designs and interpersonal play. For example, pain. All of us from time to time have had to take care of a significant other or have witnessed another person who's not feeling well or have some type of injury or pain. As a result, they're irritable. Pain in and of itself produces much more likely aggressive behavior. Heat and humidity also play central roles in aggression. The warmer a temperature, unbearable the temperature, the warmer a climate is, the more humidity a building may have or the heat it may have, oftentimes aggression is much more prominent. So if you consider this even in terms of schools that may not have air conditioning and there are extremely hot or humid days, you should obviously consider the means for aggression is going to be much more likely during those days. Foul odors are another indicator that aggression is likely to occur. For instance, many of our behavior disordered and emotionally support classrooms are often placed near the rear of buildings or perhaps near a school cafeteria or near a garbage pickup. As a result, that foul odor in and of itself produces aggression, irritation, makes people on edge. Now, with students who perhaps have lower defense mechanisms, do not know how to react to display or control their aggressiveness, this can become much more problematic. Even if you consider personal body odors as well. If you've ever had to stand in line at an amusement park, and you stand next to individuals who have been there for a long time, unfortunately, and who may be exhibiting odors, it produces much more aggression, irritability in you as you have to wait in that confined area. And that leads me to the confined personal or physical space. The size of classrooms has a lot to do as well with aggression. Size, as it decreases, provides people with less room for comfort, more perceptual ability to believe that they're being judged. Just another indication of irritation. And this can become into play as well during field trips or any type of class activities that require confined space. As a side note, if you do a search, you can see on your Google search that riots are more often displayed during days of extreme temperatures. It's a strong correlation, not a cause and effect, meaning it doesn't always follow one another, but it is a strong correlation that more riots often occur during extreme heat conditions, because again, people are irritated. Our body is not corresponding, obviously, with their cognitions. They're just much more irritated. Sorry, I flipped through a screen too quick. More causes of aggression are frustration-aggression theory, relative deprivation, and provocation and reciprocation. Frustration-aggression theory means that perception of being prevented from attaining a goal will increase aggression. An example would be the greater the closeness of a goal, the increases in aggression will likely occur. An example would be cutting in line. If you've been waiting in line at a grocery store, and we've all had these instances happen to us, when someone cuts in front of you, perhaps intentionally or even unintentionally, your aggression level, your irritation level increases. Another example would be if you're in the checkout line for 5 items and below, and someone comes in with 10 items. The greater that it prevents you from achieving your goal of checking out, the more irritation that you're going to display. When frustration is unexpected, aggression itself increases. Relative deprivation is a cause of aggression when you perceive that you or a group have less than you deserve, expect, or less than those that are similar to you. This all centers on that perception of being treated fairly, or if you perceive someone else as gaining an advantage that you do not have the ability to obtain. Provocation and reciprocation, if you're insulted, you're likely to behave much more aggressively. If we perceived an act as unintentional, no aggression comes into play. This is often the case with adolescents. Oftentimes adolescents assume that if they're bumped or something happens to them in a hallway, that people are intentionally doing something to them, when they may or may not be. That's just a cognitive function of adolescent egocentrism, a natural development. But again, if a student does not have good defense mechanisms of themselves, an ability to handle certain types of frustration, this may become another means for displaying aggression. So now we move on to the extremes, the school violence, and how we begin to look at those extremes within those individuals who perhaps are not as well prepared for handling frustration and or aggression. There's a 5-factor model of juvenile homicide. The first factor is situational. You need to consider, has a child been abused or exposed to abuse, neglect, or absence of a positive male role model? Overwhelmingly, we say a positive male role model because we want to ensure that aggression, because again, mainly perceived and acted upon within the gender of male, Males have to have a positive role model to be able to help them understand appropriate forms of managing aggression. An example I can give you from one of the individuals I had dealt with in a family therapy situation was a stepfather who encouraged his son, when he became frustrated, to go out and beat a tree, literally punch a tree. Again, as you can see, this is not an appropriate means for managing aggression. This individual learned to succumb to his pain, perhaps develop a threshold for not understanding that pain or feeling that pain, and sought out violence as a means to control his irritation or frustration. Societal influences is a crisis in leadership and a lack of heroes witnessing any type of violence as well. Resource availability. Does the student have access to guns? Is there involvement with drug and alcohol? Are there poverty and a lack of resources, again, for managing frustration, aggression? And then finally, we begin to look at personality. Does the student have low self-esteem? Do they have poor means to manage any type of irritation, or what we refer to as defense mechanisms? Are they bored? Do they have poor judgment? Have they been raised or exposed to prejudice and hatred? Do they feel, and this is the most important aspect, that they have little to lose? Most aggression results when someone feels that they have no more choices to make. They have nothing to lose. And then biological disorders that may produce obvious irritation, chemical imbalances, for instance. And a combination of any of those four factors increases the likelihood that aggression is likely to occur. So when we look at violent offenders in schools, we can break it down into two categories. There are avengers. If you want to think of avengers, think of them in terms of revenge. They're seeking revenge. They have intention and planning. And this is based upon the teen version of the FBI's profile of the workplace offender. So instead of using workplace avenger, they've transformed it to classroom avengers. School shooters signify a more random reaction. It can be differentiated from classroom avengers by stating that there is no real identified target. Oftentimes it may be terroristic, but the key word is there's no identified target. It's much more random with no cause of specific vengeance. So what are the characteristics of violent youth? Most are not psychotic. Most are in touch with reality. They do not have any type of disability, mental and or physical, that prevents them from not being able to understand right or wrong. Most receive diagnoses of relatively mild disorders, which may be ADHD, which may be oppositional defiant, which may be depression and or anxiety. Many meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. They've been exposed to some type of historical or personal experiential violence. Most have average to above average intelligence. This, as you can see, often makes sense because they're able to plan. They're able to think about their targets. Most have higher verbal IQs. Many have comorbid learning disabilities. I point this out because many may, as a result of frustration or perhaps even being singled out and or made fun of for specific academic inabilities, often lead to aggression. Most have serious family maladjustments. They aren't something that we typically see, but after the fact, unfortunately, we learn of these maladjustments. And most are often misdiagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. This comes into play simply because most do not meet the criteria for what is called a childhood version of conduct disorder. In order to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as an adult, a student must have had conduct disorder, such as fire setting, cruelty to animals, extreme school truancy, disregard for rules, in order to be classified as antisocial personality disorder. School shooters, and I put this up first, our research is limited. We're learning, and that's why you're here and I'm here. We're learning every day. And these death rates are low, thank goodness. We do see them sensationalized, obviously, on the television and in our media, but in accordance with statistical significance, they are still at a low rate in which we're gaining information every day. There's uncontrollable anger. It's usually covert. Not many have viewed, and it is oftentimes openly displayed. They have depression. They blame others for their problems. This results in projection or rationalization. They oftentimes say another person is difficult, not them. It's the other person that's causing them to behave in a manner in which they are. They threaten violence. You will oftentimes see after the fact, unfortunately, and if we begin to start looking at these signs and signals now, they're shown in their drawings especially, and in their writings. They have a detailed plan to commit violent acts. This is always the case. Something is always communicated to someone else or communicated in their own writings, their blogs, their Facebook accounts, their Instagrams, whatever it may be, it's leading to an act of violence. More than half, as I mentioned, have produced violent drawings and or threatened suicide. Ironically, cruelty to animals is found in less than half. So it is not simply if an individual has been cruel to an animal that they will oftentimes take out their aggression as a school shooter. They've been isolated or rejected by their peers. Again, their frustration builds their ability to, or I should say their inability to rationalize or perceive situations as they are often tainted by their own feelings of isolation and rejection. They have a fascination with guns and explosives. They fantasize about obtaining revenge or obtaining some type of justice to perceive their wrongs or to achieve fames. They have violent intentions, are not always easily communicated, easily communicated, and they're detailed. And their warnings are not often taken seriously, unfortunately. The caveat with this is that the FBI explored variables of school shooters. And when they did this, they found that no particular combination of variables reliably distinguished school shooters from other students. This sounds almost discouraging, but it gives you an indication of the population, adolescents, with what we're dealing with. All adolescents from time to time exhibit these types of behaviors. Each and every one of them could probably check off one of these characteristics. However, what's important in understanding this and through this training is that it's the intensity with which it's communicated. It's the understanding that no longer can we just ignore a threat and say that this student isn't capable. Anyone can be capable of violence. So we have to begin to look at a combination of variables coupled with intensity and duration, as well as what we'll see with appropriate support systems to determine whether or not violence will occur. So let's look at Classroom Avengers overview. And I'm going to pull all these up so you can look at these with me. Foremost, they're oftentimes depressed, suicidal, typically Caucasian adolescent males, and their motive is personal vengeance, achievement of some type of notoriety. They're looking to compensate for feelings of being or perceived as being put down. Oftentimes you'll see a seasonality component, a December or May, for instance, act. And this occurs predominantly because their routine has been disrupted. In December, obviously, there are holidays that are beginning to surface. School is on vacation oftentimes in many districts. In May, again, there's a series of culminating events, graduation, plays, prom, etc. And these cause significant interpersonal distress and or heightened types of frustration. First and second ranked predictors after the fact, when these incidents occur, rape and past history of homicide are not found to be present. The motives are similar to workplace avengers. 24 hours to 2 weeks after an incident has transpired that is of particular meaningfulness to that avenger has transitioned. There's a short-term precipitant. There's either some type of discipline by parents or authorities, such as a school principal. Rejection, bullying, or humiliation by peers and or girlfriends. And these are just examples of lows that can occur in a student's life. Central motive is vengeance. The secondary motive is notoriety. They want to get back at someone and they want to achieve some type of personal superiority for recognition of their feelings. Their action is premeditated, and it is oftentimes a premeditated shooting spree. The famous American psychiatrist Carl Menninger developed a triad of what's called the Menninger triad for suicide. And this triad has been applied to school avengers. These students wish to die. They have a sense of hopelessness. They wish to kill. They have a need for revenge. They wish to be killed because they have guilt. Violence is likely when two or more of the factors are in play. Violence is certain when 3 or more of the factors are in play. If we move on to dispositional or demographic factors, I'll pull these up for you. Oops. They are typically physically healthy. They're Caucasian males with an average age of 16, with an 11 to 18-year-old range. And if you think about this, this is the cognitive level. Again, we come back to those perceptions and meanings at which students develop hypothetical deductive thinking. What that means is they're able to consider what ifs. They're able to consider possibilities. They're able to plan. They oftentimes are from blue-collar to middle-class families, rural to suburban areas with populations under 50,000. The family appears superficially normal, but is oftentimes, as we had mentioned previously, dysfunctional. Intense friction between parents and between parents and child. There is explicit covert anger and hostility. Oftentimes, there are uninvolved fathers. Again, this comes back to what I had previously mentioned about social learning for understanding how to handle and manage stress and frustration. It again stresses the importance of appropriate male role models. Discipline is harsh or inconsistent. They're familiar or proficient with firearms. Their family owns guns. The weapon typically comes from the home. The physical characteristics are unremarkable, and they may have a tendency for militant attire because of their small in stature. No body piercings or markings. They typically have a negative body image, and oftentimes they're termed as geek and or nerd, not only by others, but by themselves. Historical factors is there's typical temperamentalness in infancy. This plays into the fact that if you consider a baby that is, or an infant that has a normal temperament, parents are going to respond with normal behaviors. They're going to be joyous. They're going to be happy. They're going to be pleased. Frustration is going to be at a low. With infants that are temperamental, it causes much more stress within the household among the parent-child interaction. And as a result, more frustration ensues and is modeled. They have late development of developmental milestones. They are late maturers, which in and of themselves oftentimes causes significant frustration within the preteen and teen atmosphere. They have a history of attachment difficulties. They display lying, fire setting, and or animal abuse. There's typical sibling rivalry. Adults oftentimes regard these individuals as normal. They could converse well with adults. They have normal academic performance to above average. However, this performance tends to decline in weeks prior to the incident. There's no extensive history of delinquency, so there are not any of the typical warning factors that we would think signify a cause for aggression. They're not regarded as troublemakers. They typically are the individuals who sit in the back of the room, don't engage with others, do their work, don't cause any problems. They're immature, introverted, and lack empathy. They typically prefer the company of younger peers. Their play materials are not age appropriate. Younger peers look up to them. They are not judgmental, as would be their own age group. They may belong to groups with eccentric, nihilistic worldviews, and from that, they seek validation for their need for vengeance and revenge. They're oftentimes intolerant of others and bored with normal pastimes. They're fascinated by explosives and violence. Another indicator is they're familiar with what's called the Jolly Roger Cookbook. This is a book of nihilistic types of terroristic formulas that has been banned from various websites and book sales simply because it provides literally a cookbook for engaging in terroristic types of acts. They inappropriately seek attention to shock and impress. Again, they're looking to validate themselves. They're looking to impress others. They're looking for some type of personal recognition. Clinical factors, they have above average IQ. They're typically rigid and have an inflexible cognitive style, an all or nothing type of thinking. To put it in layman's terms, they tend to look at others, you're either my friend or you're not my friend. You're either good or bad. I either like or dislike you. There is nothing that is mid-range. Their mood is significantly depressed, but they do not openly complain or display sadness. Their depression is oftentimes termed masked depression. It's an agitation. It doesn't have to be as we would typically think of depression in terms of sadness. They're hypersensitive to criticism, suspicious, and distrustful. Again, this validates their social interpretations. They believe others are always judging them. They have covert vandalism. They blame others for setbacks and project that blame onto others. They think of themselves as victims. They're oftentimes awkward, especially socially, and that's because of peer engagement. To adults, they don't oftentimes appear as awkward. Self-esteem is unstable, and it may be extreme ends where they feel worthless to a sense of narcissism as well. Oftentimes, their sexual identity is confused, and this comes back into an understanding of they are late maturers. So they're individuals who have a sense of inferiority regarding their sexual identity to begin with. Premeditated violent actions, they survey, they fantasize, and they test weapons. And they oftentimes finesse their way through mental health evaluations. This is often the indicator because of their high verbal IQ. Contextual variables. They're exposed to multiple psychosocial stressors, and again, as I mentioned, anywhere from 2 weeks to 24 hours prior to an incident, they have some type of low, something that has upset them, something that has disrupted their ability to cope, and something that they feel that they no longer have a choice. They have real or imagined stressors. This is important because it comes back to perception. It may not be something that we overtly see, but to them, it is something that is perceived as harmful and as extremely frustrating, such as discipline, public ridicule, perceived unfair treatment, loss of a relationship, or bullying by peers. They're highly publicized similar events that typically have transpired near the time of their enactment that may be real and or fictional. And they have prolific journal, letter writing, verbalizations that convey a sense of despair, violence, and alienation. And this is highly predictable when it's coupled with other variables that we have discussed. So what do we do about it? How do we begin to look at assessing our youth? There are some key considerations. Understanding the risk factors, knowing what I have just presented in the previous slides. Know the base rates for violence, for specific populations, for genders, etc. Make the risk assessments as opposed to predictions. It's not any more acceptable to say yes or no that a threat is going to transpire. It's at what level, at what intensity could this threat occur? And consider the context of the situation, most importantly, to improve risk assessments. Number 4 is a very significant factor because many threats can be prevented if an appropriate context or support system can immediately be put into place. A guided clinical assessment is a checklist of factors or elements that should be included. You need to look at clinical risk factors, such as, is there substance abuse or a mental health behavioral disorder? Historical risk factors. Are there instances of home or family adjustment, conflict, or abuses? Contextual risk factors. Do they have access to guns? Have they experienced peer rejection or currently experiencing peer rejection? And are there protective or resiliency factors? Is there absence of substance abuse? Is there a positive role model? What are the individual's strengths that could be used? This brings us to what's termed as third-generation research. This is a new perspective or approach that poses probabilistic and not dichotomous questions. And again, we're looking at not under what circumstances will this student likely act, but what are the conditions, what is the intensity with which they will act. It's no longer appropriate to look at will a student react or not react. It's no longer a yes or no question. Begin to identify relevant static factors, such as demographics and past history of violence. These are things that cannot change. You cannot change someone's sex. You cannot change someone's racial or ethnic identity. These are things that we have to consider in terms of risk factors in accordance with specific situations that the individual is exposed to. Identifying relevant dynamic factors. Are there clinical conditions or contextual factors that come into play? And identify relevant protective factors. These can change, as can the dynamic factors. Depression, anxiety, where a student lives, where they sit, those can change. And who they perceive as a support system can change. We want to minimize the risk and strengthen the protective factors. So when we begin to look at the structure of a risk assessment, we want to be able to look at static risk factors, things that are unchangeable, such as age, past history of violence. Dynamic factors, which can be changed, and these include clinical conditions and situational factors, as well as access to guns, access to violent material. And protective factors, positive attributes that mitigate against violence, including resiliency and social competence. What are their strengths? Who can we utilize to help strengthen their defense mechanisms? And then we want to include management strategies, treatment, supervision, and social supports. Essentially monitoring, following up, not casting the student aside when we no longer perceive them as a threat, but continuing that support to build their appropriate interactions. So what can we do? What is important to understand is that zero tolerance in and of itself is not the answer. We have to consider the circumstances. We have to consider the factors that are present, that perhaps mitigate violence or perhaps promote support. If we adopt a negative outcome, such as looking at zero tolerance, we can see that research has shown us that there are elevated dropout rates. There is poor school climate, lower academic achievement, oftentimes discriminatory school discipline practices. And the zero tolerance is associated with higher depression rates, drug addictions, and home life stressors. What I'll leave you with is what I often remind my students of. It's called the Goldilocks principle. There must be a balance. Too much, too little, just right. And we have to arrive at what the just right is for the individual, the school, and the broader community. I thank you for your time. And again, I especially thank you for your willingness to serve as an agent of change in this very, very important issue.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sweitzer. That was a phenomenal presentation. I'm sure everyone, including myself, learned a great deal about school threat analysis. So thank you very much for your time. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to each of you, and I would highly encourage you to share it with anyone you feel may have an interest in this topic or could benefit from the discussion and the information that Dr. Sweitzer presented today. Thank you to all who joined us this afternoon, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.